Joining us today. My name is Jenny Linden, and I have great pleasure in introducing Jean Johnston, who's going to be presenting the session. My role will be to facilitate the session, so I shall be keeping an eye on the chat box and would really encourage you as we go through to post up your messages, your thoughts, responses to the ideas that Jean discusses, and also, of course, to ask any questions. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Jean. Jean actually is joining us from Sydney in Australia today, so we're really testing the internet connection and on the online connectivity. Jean is an occupational psychologist who works in independent practice. He runs his own practice, in fact, called Working Matters, and he's obviously got considerable experience in the area of recruitment and setting up and running assessment centres. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Jean. Thanks, Jean.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon to all of you, although it's evening here for me. This session is really about, is intended for small to medium-sized business owners or people working in those organizations to help them understand how they might better, more wisely select staff. So the premise really is that you don't know a lot, although I do appreciate there may be some psychologists on the call who know a bit more. There will be some cutting-edge research I'll be delivering at the very end, I promise you that. But also the premise is that you have a situation where you need to design a new job or you're hiring new staff and you don't know what to do. So that's really what this is about. It's the basic building blocks of employee selection. So what we're going to do in this short time, in 40 minutes, is we're going to look at first job competencies. What are they? How you might understand them. And then we're going to look at what prediction is, because that's where the real science comes in, although it's a science and an art. And then we'll look about how you might build your own selection process. And again, obviously, you know, these are just the building blocks. Certainly, if you have further questions, we can direct you to, you know, where you can find out more detail about these processes and concepts. And as Jenny said, please do ask questions throughout. I'll try to answer them as I can. Right, so the context is you have a role or a job to be filled. And when you're in that situation, really what you need to know are two different things. And the first thing is what has to be done in that role. So what does the person do? That's probably the easier of those tasks. However, you know, you could be in a situation where you have a very new role and you need to consider what you want that person or what you want that job to do and not do. More often than not, we might be in situations where we're just, you know, filling roles, we already know that. But, you know, for some instances, that's going to be your challenge. The more challenging question is, in order to do those tasks, what do you need to be able to have in that person, in the incumbent or in the person that takes in the role? So what's required for success in that role? And the way we refer to that is competency. And although the general HR community, if you are in HR, tends to use competency as a broad brush term, in psychology or in occupational psychology, we are taught that you can distinguish between at least 4 different elements, and that's called the KSAO. Okay? So if you have any thoughts on what these are as I'm speaking, please do, you know, enter them in the chat box. But I'm going to give you the distinction and how they are distinct from each other, but also definitions. So first of all, a knowledge is a body of information, something that's factual, you know, something that you need to know, might be about a particular discipline, but also it could be procedural. So how do you do something? How do you do accounting processes? That would be knowledge, just as some examples. And a clear thing about knowledge is it can be learned. So depending on, obviously, about the job and the body of information, it might be more technical or more complex than others, but it can be learned. And knowledge, or proxy for knowledge, might be a qualification, an accreditation. You can ask somebody if they know something, but usually we take faith that a qualification or accreditation will represent that knowledge. So something that can be learned, that's important to keep in mind. A skill is an observable proficiency to perform a certain task that also can be learned, usually can be learned, although obviously some skills are more complex than others. So a really simple example, say for an administrator, skill is to be able to create a PowerPoint deck. And that, as you probably know that can be learned. In contrast, an ability is something that is harder to learn because we see it as an underlying capacity to do or learn something, and it's not easily trained. And a very common, albeit controversial, ability is general mental ability or intelligence. You probably all have heard of that. It is something that's a very well-known construct in occupational psychology and other fields as well, such as educational psychology. Another one would be spatial understanding or spatial ability. So these are things that cannot easily be trained. And the distinction here is, if there are lots of skills and knowledge in a job that's been trained, they can be developed in a job. If you can't be if they can't be trained, then they probably have to be hired for, meaning selected for, because you can't develop them easily. Now, those are your core sort of things, the knowledge, skills, abilities. But you're probably thinking, what about this, what about that? Well, those things fall into other characteristics. And these are things like personality. So, we have personality tools. It may be your experience. You expect a person to have so many years of experience, the types of experience in a job. It could be really practical, like will a person be willing to move to a different location? So I've done work at Ford Motor Company. They have their credit office up in Manchester. They may ask somebody when they hire them down in Dagenham or in Essex, are you willing to move to Manchester? The person says no, then they can screen them out of the process because there might be a requirement. Legal requirements also may be involved. For example, you have to be a citizen or you have to be a certain age. So other characteristics takes up all those things that are not knowledge, skills, and abilities. And there are probably some things that I haven't added in there as well. You could probably think of some of them. Okay, so if we know what KSAOs are, we start thinking about them as a concept, competencies, in addition to tasks. How do we know what the tasks and competencies are for a given role? Right? So you have a new job, a new role you're creating. How do you know what those competencies are? Again, if you'd like to type in some responses, how you might do that, what processes you might use, feel free to do that. Let's give 30 seconds for some answers. What do you think will be the process to identify these tasks and competencies or different methodologies? Yes, Jackie, job analysis, that's right, yeah. So job analysis is often what we talk about. However, if you ever studied job analysis at a university course, like in a graduate program, you'll find that there are a lot of processes that are very outdated and are not very user-friendly for small organizations. Now, if you were in a court of law and you were, being sued by somebody in a class action suit because there was some discrimination and they wanted to prove that you haven't done job analysis, yeah, it's going to be really important. But what I would say is that for smaller organizations, one-man band hiring a new person, or a smaller organization, somebody who has 11 people that work for them, that may be too complex. So there are variations in job analysis that we can come up with, but are not technical and complex. Ali has written, talking to the hiring manager. That's right. You should always talk to the hiring manager, actually. What is it you want? HR is often criticized for not being aware of what the hiring manager wants and just sort of hiring people who seem to fit in a box as opposed to fit the actual job requirements. Hiring managers should have probably a very good idea of what they want. Okay. Any others? One thing that I remember from my graduate school days is you should always observe the job being performed if you can. So if the job already exists, you should look at what the people are doing. Because if you don't necessarily see them doing it, how could you understand the job? What people tell you may vary from what they actually do, and that could be the hiring manager telling you something that benefits them, that doesn't benefit the employee, or have impossible for the employee to do. It could be the employee trying to benefit themselves, to try to dig up their job if they think it'll help with the evaluation of the job work, and so on. So certainly looking at what gets done, if possible, if it's not, if it's an already existing job. What I would suggest, I mean, there are many different methodologies, but what I would suggest if you start from scratch is to simply look for archival information. And what I mean by that is, first, look online for job descriptions for similar roles elsewhere. So imagine you're looking for an administrative role, PA, you know, a clerk, things like that. Any of those types of jobs, they're all pretty similar. So look first for an online job description. If you're in a law firm, look, you know, Google job description, PA law firm, and you'll probably find something. You know, there's nothing new under the sun. And certainly you don't have to take everything they say. It's just a starting point. But what I would say, if you want to be a bit more systematic, there are two great resources. There is the ONET, which the U.S. government produces, and then there is, sorry, my page just went back. There is the International Standard Classification of Occupations. Now, the ISCO is an international document. However, you can find variations of it in many countries. So, for example, the UK would have its own version. New Zealand has its own version, and so on and so on. So you can find them. Now, the ISCO is great because it is an international standard. However, it can be a bit academic, not so user-friendly. So what I'm going to hone in on right now is ONET, which is very user-friendly and anyone can use. So with ONET, the first thing you would do is you would go in and you would identify a role that you're interested in. Now, if you look at all these roles here, these come under administrative roles. And on the basis of this, you could look for very specific ones depending on where you're working. You know, if you're working in a police, fire, and ambulance service, you can see very near the top, you can find those dispatchers. But let's say, for example, you just want to find a generic administrative role, and you opt for word processors and typists. Okay? So that's where we'll go in terms of this search. Okay? So if you look for word processors and typists, this is what comes up, and you can see how user-friendly it is and also how it fits the KSAO model. So the first thing it does is it says, here are the typical types of tasks. And I haven't actually selected the longer version here. It's only showing the first 5 of 19. But you can see that it would be quite complex. There's at least 19 tasks for this word processor and typist role that you could look at and think, is that what I want my people to do in my organization? You may find that there are things that are not relevant. You can see, for example, they're still saying sending faxes, you know, isn't probably that common these days. So again, you use it as a starting point to help flesh out your own job description. So those are the tasks. And the other things are your KSAOs. And you can see it starts out with very specific technology skills, which are very appropriate for the word processors and typists. You know, it's no longer the time when people are using typewriters, using computers, laptops, using all sorts of software and so on. So you can see it's very specific here, IBM Notes, Microsoft Outlook, Microsoft Excel, and so on. So this is just a starting point again. The next page, you can see we've got your knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? And, you know, you consider knowledge, those are the only 4, clerical, English language, customer personal service, computers, and electronics. So in general, the job analysts who determined this sort of job description have thought about all the types of things that go in these generic role of word processor and typist, and this is the knowledges. And the same for skills and abilities. And you can see how some of them, like active listening, reading comprehension, they are things that can be learned. There are also some things that may be quite difficult at times to tangibly assess, like how can you assess active listening, right? You can assess reading comprehension quite easily by doing some reading comprehension tests. But you're going to always find a mix of things that are tangible and intangible. And again, this will dictate what you decide how your process will look in terms of selecting people. And really this relates to whether you're going to buy or build. And this is the term that we use in the discipline. You're going to buy in your people or you're going to develop or build them. And remember, some things you can develop, some things are not developable that easy. It takes a long time to train or wouldn't be very easy to train. And I'll give you a great example. When I went to university and we ate in the cafeteria women who served the food had obviously been trained in customer service skills. And they always, the phrases that came out of their mouths were, hello, how are you, how may I help you? But the way they said it was, hello, how are you, how may I help you? Meaning they had no interest whatsoever in us as customers. So it's a great distinction between we could train the skills, but they actually hadn't hired people who were oriented towards customer service. So if it was that important, they should have hired people who like working with people, like serving students, maybe demanding students, as well as being able to be trained in customer service skills. That's just a very simple example of the distinction. So let's say, we're working on the premise that whatever we're going to select in the KSAOs, we want to build into our employment process. So before we talk about what potential predictors may be, let's first try to get an understanding of what prediction means and how we define it. And this is where some of the science comes in. So first of all, when we talk about prediction, we're looking at the correlation between something that's going to predict job performance and job performance itself. The predictor on the left, you can see there, could be anything. It could be the scores from an interview. It could be an intelligence test or a general mental ability test scores, personality score, profile. It could be anything really that you're using as a predictor. You could even put attractiveness as a predictor. Now, we typically don't use that. They're rare. We typically don't. But anything could be used as a predictor or an independent variable in terms of predicting job performance. When we talk about correlation, remember, you should be aware that correlations don't prove causality. We can't say that one caused the other, but there is a correlation. There's a relationship between the two. On the very left, you see a perfect correlation, and that would be a correlation of 1, and correlations go from 0 to 1. Now, a perfect correlation is when every point on the predictor predicts exactly every point in job performance. Right? So you could build a straight line, and every point would go through that straight line. Perfect correlations are never seen. You'll never see them. It could be partially because what we do in employment selection through occupational psychology is an imperfect science. We often say it's a science and an art, but it could be that there's always going to be things that will have exceptions because we just don't have perfect predictors. We have something called the criterion problem, meaning we don't always know we're actually measuring the right criterion. What is job performance? Imagine you as a manager. We know what would make a good manager, so what's the right criterion for job performance? So in any case, we never get a perfect correlation. Let me also say at this point that these are positive correlations. So a positive correlation of 1 would be on the left. If you reverse that, going from right to left, that would be a negative correlation. And that simply means it's not negative in its own sake. It just means that the relationship is in a different direction. So in a positive correlation, as the predictor scores go up, the job performance goes up. In a negative correlation, as the predictor scores go up, job performance goes down, or vice versa. So as predictor scores go down, job performance goes up. It just simply means it's a reverse. It doesn't mean it has to be negative. So, for example, you could say, in our particular interview, the way we scored it, for whatever reason, as the scores went up, job performance went down. And you have to know what you're actually assessing for that to have any meaning. I'll give you an example. Maybe as somebody who's got smaller hands, has higher dexterity, has greater dexterity for a particular job because smaller hands do better, therefore job performance would increase. So the smaller your hands, the greater the job performance will be a negative correlation. In terms of the middle box there, you can see a strong correlation, but not perfect, and that tends to be more what we see. And what that means is some of the scores, or most of the scores, will circulate around that straight line, but they're not all on the straight line, okay? So the ones that aren't on the straight line, they're either near it, or you could see some totally far away from it, meaning it's a exception or an outlier. The box on the right side, you can see that it would be impossible to draw one straight line through, or there we go, oops, through those data points. And that means there's no relationship. It's a zero correlation, okay? And typically we see that with lots of different things, as you'll see in just a moment. So, what we're really looking for is the box in the middle, because we're never going to achieve the box on the left, and we don't want the box on the right, okay? Right, so what do you think is the best predictor job performance? There's been a study done by a guy named Schmidt, of Schmidt and Hunter fame, if you've read his earlier stuff or their earlier stuff, and they've just updated the Schmidt and Hunter 1998 studies looking at the validity or the accuracy of job predictors. And they actually look at 30 different predictors. There's just a few of them here. So Jenny's going to give you a poll, and you can tell me, what do you think is the best predictor job performance? So pick one of them.
Just opened up the poll, and you've got a couple of minutes to complete the poll. That's great. I can see almost everybody's finished. Just a few more responses coming in. Nearly there. We've got about 30 seconds to go. So if you do want to respond and haven't had a chance yet, do click on your preferred response. And nearly there. Just about to close the poll, and then I'll be able to publish it. Okay, so you should be able to see the poll on your screen now. Can you see the results? Can you see the results, Jean?
I can, yes. Thank you.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so really interesting results, seeing the spread, actually. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the responses, which you can see on the screen now, and give you a sense of why they are as they are. Now, what some of you may have known is that general mental ability or intelligence is the single best predictor. And although this study was just produced in November of last year, and we published it, I imagine, sometime this year, we've known for a long time that intelligence is the single best predictor. And I'll come back to that in just a bit. It's actually quite a controversial finding for many reasons, particularly in the States, where a lot of civil service organizations use general mental ability in selection processes, and people of color tend to perform one standard deviation on average lower than white people. So it's quite controversial. But I'll come back to that in just a bit as to why it's the single best predictor. I suppose if we look at some of the other things here, employment interviews, one of the surprising findings in this most recent review is that employment interviews, if you don't distinguish between, typically we would distinguish between structured and unstructured employment interviews. And what this study has found is they have equal validity, which is amazing, an amazing finding, because for years we've been saying that you have to do structured interviews. The reason why we're finding this difference is that they have a new correction for restriction of range, and that wasn't used, say, 20 years ago. So that still doesn't explain why unstructured interviews should be doing as well as structured interviews. So I think that we're going to have to do some further research on that. I'm going to tell you in a while why you still probably want to do structured interviews in any case. I'm just trying to hide this thing here. The other thing that we want to keep in mind here is that if you look at some of the things that are near the top, they tend to make sense. The job knowledge test, job tryout, assessment centers, they're all things that are actually either we know that there's great research on them, or they're very practical in how they simply replicate what is on the job. So job knowledge test, if it's well done, is simply taking information from the job and putting it in paper and asking people whether they know it. You would expect that to be relevant. A job tryout, you would expect somebody in a real situation, with however they perform in that situation, to correlate with actual job performance. Some of the things in the bottom we've known for years as well. So if you're in the know, these make sense to you. Reference checks historically don't have great validity because employers won't give great references these days because of legal issues. And if they give a reference, you have to be suspicious about it because why give a reference if you might get in trouble legally? Personality tests. If you're in the personality field, you probably say they're the best thing, especially emotional intelligence. But we know that generally it has to be very specific to the job to be valid. And most personality tests are broad brush, so we tend to use all the variables, for example, of the OPQ32, maybe only, 6 or 7 that might be relevant. Maybe some surprising findings for you is that job experience is not that relevant, not that valid. And generally what that means is just because you've been in a job doesn't mean you're great at the job, right? Perhaps even more surprising is personal organization fit is not that valid. And the logic there is that although you may find somebody who fits the values or the culture, it doesn't mean they can do the job. And remember, we're looking at the job. So it's important to keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that personal organization fit because many organizations think that it's essential. And on the one hand, you probably can't blame them. On the other, it isn't valid. And hopefully you already know, I don't know if anyone put down pathology as accurate or valid, but we've known for years that generally there's no validity for it. So certainly, if you're interested in these findings, go to the paper which is cited there. We get the slides, and you'll find it online. You can easily access it. Okay, so why gender mentality? Well, there's a lot of evidence that tells us why intelligence is the single best predictor. But do keep in mind, it's the single best predictor, it's not the only predictor. First of all, we know it has the highest validity, and it tends to be the least in cost. Even though for a small employer, practically speaking, you may find it relatively expensive, it is the least sort of cost-driven of most of the tools that you can have access to. We also know that it has more research than any other method. And this research has been around for probably almost 100 years, okay? And it comes not just from occupational psychology, but it comes from educational psychology and affiliated disciplines. It's the best available predictor of job-related learning as well. So on-the-job performance and job-related learning. So we look at training on the job as well, typically. It has the strongest theoretical foundation for any method. When you look at what intelligence is, basically it's about making judgments and decision-making, and it just makes sense because most jobs require some form of judgment. And the higher you grow up in the hierarchy in organizations, the more ability should be relevant. Now, you may be saying, yeah, but I know some pretty stupid executives. How did they get ahead? Well, remember, it's a single best predictor, but it's not the only predictor. So there are likely other attributes like personality, and perhaps some other things that are also predictive for that job, and that's why that person is where they are. And there are other things too that aren't predictive, like politics and nepotism and so on. So all sorts of reasons why somebody might get ahead, not just ability. Okay, so I said before that what we're doing is an imperfect science. It's a bit of both, it's a bit of science and an art. So you're not going to ever get a perfect correlation, but what does that correlation mean? So generally, whenever you see a correlation for predictability, square it, so times it by itself, and that tells you what percentage of job performance or variance it is predicting. So the ability test at 0.65, which is pretty high, is still only predicting 42% of that particular type of jobs in general. So what that means is we still have 58% that we have no idea what is relevant. How can we predict it? So it means you could hire a person on the basis of just using an ability test and still not know a lot about whether they'll succeed. And that's why you often get that imperfect correlation, because there are other things that are relevant. So this is why we would never use one predictor for selection. We would use multiple predictors. The other thing you have to keep in mind, I already mentioned, is the adverse impact. And this is when you may use a predictor to hire somebody, but the score on the predictor has no relationship to the actual job performance. So you may say, for example, that a person of color in America has a lower ability test score, therefore it looks like they might perform worse than a white person, but in reality they don't perform worse. And that's what we call adverse impact. So we need to be careful about that. Ability tests do have, they are known to adverse impact, but there are a number of other predictors that have less adverse impact, like the structure interview, like job buyouts and so on. Okay, so we know that we shouldn't use one selection tool. You can certainly combine them. And when you combine, essentially what you want to do is you want to maximize your predictability. So you really don't want to ever combine two different predictors that measure the same thing. So maybe you have two different ability tests, and for some reason you're using them both. If they don't actually predict different aspects of the job, then there's no point using them both. You'd be wasting your time and your money. So they need to tap different elements or different constructs of job performance. And so what you're seeing with these two examples here, integrity test and structured employment interview, is they are tapping different aspects, because the correlation goes from 0.65 to 0.78 or 0.76. And you can see therefore the predictability of the prediction of job performance also increases. So that's what we're doing when we talk about selection processes or packages in terms of combining different tools. That's where we start becoming more of a science, but obviously we still don't get perfect correlation. All right, so what can you do in terms of your selection approach? What might you use? It's going to depend upon what you have to assess. So what are those things that you can't develop, that you need to buy in or select on? KSAOs, how much time have you got? What's your budget? Right? As I said before, ability tests can be the cheapest, but they are relatively expensive. Other tools are going to cost more money. Assessment centers are very expensive. Okay? The other thing you need to keep in mind is if you're going to use psychometrics, that's the general term for ability tests and personality tests and integrity tests. They need to be interpreted, and for most of these things, they need to be interpreted by people with qualifications, i.e. occupational psychologists. However, there are some organizations that will accredit non-psychologists in things like certain ability tests is very, very easy to do, but also personality tools. The accreditation can be expensive, but in the end, if you're using them quite often, it can be worth it for you. Okay? When it comes to things like job knowledge, tryouts, work samples, they can be developed in-house. You still want to make sure that you actually are doing them carefully. There are concepts like construct validity and space validity and so on. So don't just willy-nilly do them. Do carefully think them through. Okay, so I've got a question here from Jackie. How do you get the combined validity score? Okay, Jackie, that's what we call incremental validity. And what you do, just going back to that, is it's a statistical procedure and you correlate both the general manageability test and integrity test in this case, and you do them separately first. It's a stage-like process, and you would put general manageability in first, and then you see what the correlation is, which we think is 0.65, and then you add the integrity test, and it should only tap that job performance, or what we call variance, that's not already tapped by mental ability. And then the combined prediction is your new correlation. That makes sense? It's a bit technical, so it probably doesn't. But it's a statistical procedure. Okay? Yep, and Georgina has answered that question. There you go. Zachary, thanks, Georgina. Okay, so one of your options, I'll give you some simple options. You just want to get started, sort of with a running start, is to create a competency-based application form. And essentially, a competency-based application form looks like an application form, but what you're doing there is you're actually scoring various aspects. And some of those aspects you're screening out. So, for example, you might say, I want a knowledge of Excel. So you may ask the person, what's your skill level in Excel and Word and PowerPoint and so on. And if they put strong on everything, you may say, great, they're screened in. They put fair in all of them, you screen them out. Okay? So that's very concrete. You can also do that for less tangible skills, abilities, and other things. For example, you could look at teamwork. And you could ask them to create a paragraph, to write a paragraph, and giving you an example of teamwork. And it's the same format as you'd ask in a structured interview. Typically, it's give me the situation, give me your role, tell me what you did, tell me the outcome, and what did you learn from it. And that's the model typically you would use in an interview, structured interview, that you can also use on the application form. So it's pretty easy to use. Really, it's the two types of concrete things like accreditation and less concrete things. So SAO is skill, abilities, and other characteristics. I've not used KSAOs because most knowledge is very tangible. You see I've made the distinction? The concrete aspects are typically knowledge, skill, and ability. Sorry, knowledge, skill, and can be some other characteristics. Usually not ability because they're usually less tangible. You can't easily assess them on it in a competency-based application form. The less tangible things are skills, abilities, and other characteristics. There's obviously overlap between those two. I just made the distinction, really, how you might look at them differently on the application form. Okay. Your second option is to create a structured interview. And although I've said to you sort of what you might ask, there's a lot that goes into developing the structured interview. Basically, you have to have behaviorally-based, competency-based questions. You have to have the same questions for everybody. You have to have rating scales, and in this sense, we're talking about behavioral anchored rating scales, meaning there's behavioral definitions for each point of the rating scale, and you should have an interview panel. Now, as you can see, each of those components enhances either reliability or validity. Reliability is the consistency of the process. And a structured interview is very reliable because it has a consistent process. Validity is the accuracy. That's the predictability. And if you're actually focused on competency, that's most directly going to affect your accuracy, whereas the other things affect the consistency. If you have a very process-driven, very standardized process, research shows that you don't need to have the interview panel. If all the other things are there, you don't need to have the interview panel. Because in a small organization that limited people, then don't worry about the interview panel if you're using all the other things. If you can't do all these things, just try to put in as much structure as you can. Okay? Because remember, if you want to enhance the incremental validity, the overall validity, then the structure interview is the way to go. The two simple options for smaller organizations are the competency-based application form and the structure interview. When you get the slides, you don't really have time to go to them now. You'll see that typically there are two types of questions. There's past experience, and there's also hypothetical and situational. Now, past experience are the most commonly used because they're the most easiest to use. However, they're very transparent. Tell me about a time you had to deal with a difficult team member. Okay? It's obvious what we're asking for there. A hypothetical question is harder to develop, but it's less transparent because there's always a dilemma. And also, hypothetical questions are good for people who don't have any experience. It's not hypothetical basic like what would you do if, you have this example here, you can see there's a dilemma. And if you go one direction, it might be right, it could be wrong. If you go the other, it might be wrong, it could be right. Okay. Yes, I did say that, Georgina. You get the other aspects of the structure interview right, the makeup of the interview panel is not important. Actually, you don't need an interview panel if you have all the other process. It's enough structure. That's what the research shows. Okay, so what about assessment centers? Well, essentially, they're really expensive. I think that most organizations that use them because they're a very visible way of showing rigor, and they're very transparent. However, if you consider the validity, it may not be worth the cost, the time, and the effort. But do look at the definition there. You have to have multiple assessments. You have to have at least one simulation. It doesn't have to be an overly elaborate simulation, but it does have to replicate the job in some way, and you have to have multiple assessors. So simply sitting somebody down at a desk and giving them a psychometric and an interview is not an assessment center. Okay, so how would you visualize? Let's try to visualize what you might do in your organization. This will be our last slide. Let's say you're going to use a multiple hurdle approach, and this is what we call a stage-like approach. So first of all, you bring in, you have people complete an application form, and then you're going to screen people out on some of your concrete and less concrete aspects, your KSAOs. Then you give a smaller group, those who are screened in, the ability test. Those who pass that, you set a cutoff. Typically, organizations set it at 30 to 40 percentile. You then decide you can interview. You don't want to interview lots of people because it takes time, right? A good interview is probably at least an hour. Time and effort, you've got to get people in. You can do telephone interviews, of course. And then based upon that, you must have a very small list, short list, and you can do a work sample or tryout. Remember, they're going to be quite elaborate, so you don't want to, again, do them for lots of people. So the principles you're really working to here are, first of all, use your cheapest and most accurate tools first, weed out the less qualified. And that's why the ability test is so good, because it's the cheapest and it's pretty accurate, and it'll get rid of a lot of your less desirable people. Based upon the notion that your smarter people are going to be your better performers. You know, notwithstanding that there are other requirements as well, but you're going to get your smartest people, and that tends to be required in most jobs that require decision making. Then focus on the essential job requirements first. Don't put your nice to haves in there. The essential job requirements first. And then, in the end, often nice to have is personal organizational fit. Save that to the end. That could be a desirable thing, because remember, it only has a correlation of 0.13. It's not that predictive. A lot of organizations think that this is these needs. They like it. However, what they may be doing is choosing somebody who fits the organization but can't do the job, and that could actually relate to job discrimination. You know, an organization that's full of men might actually not assess a woman very fairly because they're looking at organizational fit. So Jackie has asked, how can you measure the success of any selection process in the short and long term? Well, in the longer term, when you have enough data, you calculate your validity. In the shorter term, I think you have to get a sense for what you're spending in money and whether you look like you're getting the right people based upon your anecdotal and day-to-day experience. You know, some will become obvious quite early on, but longer term, you know, you might not know for some jobs until 6 months or longer how well somebody's doing. And validation, certainly, you need to give at least enough time for learning curves to occur and to collect enough data. So I would say that's probably a minimum of 6 months, and it's going to depend upon how many people you put through. So for the person who has 11 people working with them, you're probably never going to be able to do an adequate validation study. And that's where you have to rely upon the literature to say what are the things that tend to be, you know, valid predictors. Laura's asked, what's the definition of job performance? Is it based on measurable outputs, basically? Yes. Every job is going to vary. If you work in an assembly line, you put widgets together, you can define job performance as productivity, the number of widgets done per hour, let's say. This is what we call the criterion problem. Some jobs, it's hard to say what actually is a core measure of job performance. How would you measure your performance as a manager? Where you make decisions, but those decisions aren't tangible. You know, do we look at how well you manage people? Do we look at how you spend your day? it's the criterion problem. We're going to have to make judgment calls. And when you talk about measuring outputs, then you think, well, how do you measure them? So this is, again, one of the reasons why it's an imperfect science. Georgina's asked, are organizational values and generic behaviors a valid thing to measure? I believe you can measure anything that can be behavioralized. Okay, so you can put it in behavior. So one time I had somebody said they hired consultants on Spark. I don't care what Spark is as long as you can define it and behavioralize it for me. You can put it into good behavior. Now, when you say generic behavior, Georgina, I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Typically, we have the competencies that are behaviorally defined relative to a job, to a specific job. So they would usually be somewhat, they're not generic. I don't know if that answers your question. They usually have some context. Okay, so the slides are made available, and I would recommend, if you're interested, go read Smith and Hunter. It can be a bit complicated, but just look for the two tables, one table related to job performance and one related to training performance, meaning how well people learn while they're on the job. And you'll see 30 different predictors looked at in those tables. Okay?
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Jean, and thank you also to all of our participants who've asked such interesting questions. There's been some interesting debate in the chat box as well. Jean, you've covered so much there, and what was really interesting for me was the engagement with the science-based to recruitment, but also some very practical applications and some useful strategies and tips that we can take away. So big thank you to Jean, and a big thank you to all our participants for all of your questions and perceptions and observations. So big thank you to everyone. Just a very quick reminder, I can see we're a little bit over time, so it just leaves me to give you a very, very quick reminder that we've got our last webinar on Tuesday, the 2nd of May, and that will be me presenting powerful communication skills, how we can develop communication skills which have an impact on everyday workplace conversations. So I'm really looking forward to working with you on the 2nd of May. And apologies for the sound, just to come back and say I'm sorry if the sound wasn't as clear this time around. I think we were really testing the internet connectivity today with Jean being in Australia, but hopefully you did catch most of what Jean was saying, and we will put the slides up on YouTube, and they will also be available if you want to email the BPS. So, and Jackie just asked a question, are these webinars available to catch up on? Absolutely, yep. So all the webinars are on the BPS site, and that address, if you just scroll a bit further up the chat box, you'll see the website address, the BPS YouTube channel, and if you click on that, you'll find all of the webinars. They're all there for you to watch. That's great. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And I shall say goodbye for now. Enjoy the rest of your week, and hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time. Bye.